This series contains sexual references, adult themes, and depictions of violence. If these things are upsetting for you, please take care while you're listening.
From the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Bondi Badlands, proudly sponsored by ACON and Waverley Council. Episode 1, A Newsreader Vanishes.
Ross was this young, driven, very handsome, engaging guy, you know.
Something bad has happened here on that Friday night and he's gone.
Welcome to Bondi Badlands, an investigation into a series of cliffside murders and mysterious disappearances in Sydney, Australia, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I'm Greg Callaghan, author and deputy editor of Good Weekend magazine and the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. These murders have haunted me for over 30 years, from when I was a young man living in Sydney, and I first started writing about the killings in the early 2000s. Bondi Badlands, my book on these murders, was published in 2007. Our story begins at Sydney's Bondi Beach, one of the most iconic beaches in the world, an international tourist attraction, drawing over 8 million tourists a year.
And in the season you can hardly see the sea for the water babies, playing Bob's your uncle in the surf. Few other cities can offer such fun on, so to speak, their own doorstep.
From when the first white men knocked up lean-tos on its sandy shores in the mid-19th century, right up until the early 1990s, Bondi remained stubbornly, scruffily working class, drawing artists and bohemians in the 1920s and 30s, surfers in the 1950s and 60s, and the first wave of backpackers in the 1970s. Until the early 90s, most residents paid rents in decaying Art Deco flats called the Cairo Mansions or the Venice Flats. Since then, Bondi has gentrified at breakneck speed and is one of Sydney's wealthiest suburbs. Every spring, the headland is dotted with sculptures for the annual art show, Sculpture by the Sea. And it's here, on this southern headland topped by a grassy verge known as Marks Park, that rock legend Elton John came in 1982 to film the video for his song Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes. His white grand piano was perched on a rocky outcrop known as Mackenzie's Point. This very spot would later become the site of a grisly murder. The name Bondi itself harks back to its Aboriginal past, meaning the sound of water crashing on rocks. "30 years ago, bodies started turning up at the bottom of the cliffs between Bondi and Tamarama beaches. Barman John Russell, whose crumpled body was found on the Bondi side of the headland, clutching a clump of his killer's blonde hair. Thai national Kritchakorn Ratana Jarathapun, who fell, or was pushed, over the cliff edge trying to flee his attackers at Mackenzie's Point, the highest part of the headland. Some vanished into thin air, like TV newsreader and weatherman Ross Warren, whose car keys were discovered on a rock ledge on the Tamarama side of the headland. And Gilles Mataney, who went for a cliffside walk one Sunday evening, never to return. There were murders right across Sydney, but it was here, on this southern headland at Bondi, that became the main killing field. Specifically, the cliffside pathway snaking around this jagged headland between Bondi and Tamarama beaches. Late at night, long after all the tourists and joggers had gone home, this place became a beat. Marks Park had been a beat as early as the 1920s. Beats were particularly popular when gay bars were few, or too risky to visit, when most gay or bisexual men were closeted. Beats were places where men could socialise, and if the conditions felt comfortable, engage in casual, anonymous sex out of public view. At Marks Park, they'd either cruise the park itself or take the steps down to the concrete pathway, sometimes rattling coins or keys to attract attention from other males. Bondi resident and former local businessman Paul Symes, has lived near Marks Park since 1984 and recalls that era around the cliff tops very well.
If you can imagine a full moon in spring or autumn or summer with no wind, there's just nothing to beat a headland like that. The other aspect to it was that it had rock ledges and cliffs, much as you see along the Sydney coastline, and you could walk along various rock ledges, 6 to 20 metres and down, and continue to walk along to little shelves, and you could sit and have your feet dangling over the ocean almost and be looking out there. So it was just a beautiful spot. If we go back to the 1980s, when homosexuality was illegal and there were no mobile phones, there were no apps, it was an opportunity to meet people.
The Bondi cliff tops had long been a magnet for closeted men.
I couldn't tell you who was bisexual and who wasn't, but I certainly would have been surprised if it wasn't the case that there weren't lots of bi guys going there and married men. I was already aware that it was violent and dangerous, and then the first of those murders, and I wouldn't have been able to work out the sequence of them, but as we started to read about that, it just confirmed what I was experiencing down there and made me more on alert, but it never stopped me going there.
Paul Symes had a couple of scary close calls.
Each of the occasions when I was most particularly fearful, I was on the top. And because I knew that parkland like the back of my hand and I could run fast, I could get away. There were other locations around the east where it was more cornered, but up there on that parkland, fortunately, I just had a sense of people coming at me and I knew to go.
Back in the 1980s, most Bondi locals considered the cliff tops a no-go zone after nightfall. Back then, the area was very poorly lit and there was no handrail skirting the cliff face as there is today. Even now, armed with the knowledge of what went on here, walking the cliff tops at night can be a disturbing experience.
Good afternoon, I'm Ross Warren. Cool again tomorrow with the heavier rain clearing down south.
That's Ross Warren, a young newsreader and weatherman for Wind TV in Wollongong in New South Wales, delivering the weather forecast in 1989. The 25-year-old was one of the station's most popular stars, a handsome man with sparkling green eyes and brown hair.
Ross left quite an impression on all of us, in fact. Ross was this young, driven, very handsome, engaging guy, you know. You could understand why he was going to be successful in television. Great hair, well-dressed, well-spoken. You know, he was smart, he was intelligent. Very attractive guy.
That's Ross's good friend, Jeff Dowse. Jeff would often have breakfast with Ross on his fortnightly visits up to Sydney. On the evening of Friday, July 21st, 1989, the 25-year-old delivered the weather forecast for the weekend ahead. It would be fine but cold, with a chance of a light shower on Sunday. Every second weekend, after reading the weather, Ross would jump in his chocolate-brown Nissan Pulsar, flick on his car cassette recorder and drive up to Sydney to catch up with friends and enjoy the nightlife. Ross had plenty to be happy about that night. After 2 highly successful years at Wind TV, in which he'd built a large fan base for his weekend news reading and amusing weather reports, Ross was ready for the move to the big smoke. Only 2 weeks before, he'd been in preliminary chats with network brass at Sydney's Channel 10. On his regular fortnightly visits to Sydney, Ross would mostly stay with a good friend, Craig Ellis, who lived in a 2-storey terrace in Redfern with his boyfriend Paul and a woman flatmate from New Zealand, Amanda. Craig still remembers that Friday night 30 years ago, the last time he would see his friend Ross alive.
I actually met Ross at Marks Park in Easter 1988. We were both there for the same purpose. It was fairly late one evening on the weekend of Easter, and we met each other there and started chatting and ended up going back to my place in Darlinghurst at the time. For a short time, I would say probably 6 or 8 weeks, something like that. We were dating and didn't last much longer than that. I was pretty keen to maintain the relationship the way it was, but Ross really just wanted to be friends. I guess I wasn't quite the right guy for him, so very quickly it went from being dating to friendship. So I think I would have been 21, and Ross was probably about 4 years older than me, something like that. So, and we had both come to Sydney from different places. So, as you said, I was from New Zealand. I'd been here for only a few months, and Ross had been working various places, including up in Queensland, up in Mount Isa, and out in Western New South Wales, I think maybe Dubbo or somewhere like that. And then he'd ended up in Wollongong. So he was getting closer and closer to Sydney, which was where he wanted to be, because that was the ultimate prize in terms of TV work that Ross wanted to do. So he'd done his apprenticeship, if you like, in some of the regional stations, some of the smaller regional stations, and he was, at the time he died, he was trying to get work in Sydney and for one of the big commercial stations.
The mood in the house that night, Friday, July 21st, 1989, was light and cheerful as the friends tucked into pizza, chatted and listened to music. Later that evening, Ross asked Craig and his boyfriend whether they wanted to join him for a few drinks on Oxford Street. They politely declined, and shortly afterwards, Ross used Craig's landline to call a work acquaintance, an 18-year-old audio operator at Win TV. Just before 11 p.m, Ross reappeared in the living room doorway looking devilishly handsome in faded jeans, a white top and a black sports coat. He was going to have a drink with Philip, he told them. They tossed around the idea of seeing a movie the following night, agreeing to an early evening session at a cinema in the city. Back in the late 1980s, Oxford Street was humming with over a dozen pubs, nightclubs and saunas. It truly was the Golden Gay Mile. The Mardi Gras parade at that time was attracting 500,000 spectators each year. Ross was very fearful of contracting HIV and always practiced safe sex. Ross was in high spirits that night, joking with friends and confiding in Philip that he was glad he hadn't run into an ex called Ken, whom he'd broken up with only weeks before. Over the 3 hours they were on the strip, winding up at a bar called the Midnight Shift, Ross drank no more than 3 beers, breaking his alcohol intake up with mineral water, as was his habit. At 2:15 a.m, Ross and Philip called it a night. As Philip's turning into Oxford Street in his own car, he happens to notice that Ross is driving east, towards Bondi, rather than taking a right turn back to Redfern. It's a cold and still night, and Ross parks his brown Nissan on the ocean side of Kenneth Street in Bondi. This is his favoured point of access on the headland, a place where he's less likely to be seen than on the more popular Bondi side. It's now 2:45 a.m. and a full moon is shining in the inky sky above. Ross, who'd come of age during the first wave of the HIV/AIDS crisis, always kept condoms in his glove box, but tonight he leaves the packet unopened. He puts his wallet in the glove box, shoves the thick clump of 8 keys that are attached to his brass keyring deep into his jeans pocket, and alights from the car. He checks that all the doors are locked. It's getting colder and windier, so he's probably not intending to stay very long. The 27 steep sandstone steps down to the pathway take him past a toilet block on the left-hand side and a wall of blonde brick units on the right. When he reaches the pathway, does he turn left towards Mackenzie's Point or right towards Tamarama? Whichever direction he takes, it's the wrong one because his killers lie in wait for the lone steps of a defenceless man.
What are you doing here, you puffer?
I'm just up for a walk, mate.
Oh, come on. Yeah, give us your money.
Money?
Give us your wallet.
I don't have
Come on.
money.
Get him, put him on the ground.
Come on, give it up, Paul. Take that, you big bag.
When Craig Ellis wakes up on the Saturday morning, he finds that Ross hasn't returned home.
I woke up in the morning and went downstairs to the living room where Ross should have been asleep and found that he wasn't there, which was surprising and a little concerning, but I immediately came to the conclusion that he must have met someone and gone back to their place and hadn't come home yet.
But by afternoon, when they're due to go and see a movie, Craig and Paul become more uneasy. This may have been the era prior to mobile phones, but it wasn't like Ross not to call on the landline. Craig calls Philip, who tells him the pair parted just after 2 a.m. on Oxford Street, and that Ross had promised to call him that afternoon, but hadn't.
So that weekend, Paul and I were spending some of our time in Paddington at Paul's brother's place. Paul's brother was away for the weekend, and we were looking after his house. So we were spending some of our time at the house in Redfern and some of the time at the house in Paddington. And I think we must have been at the house in Paddington late Saturday afternoon at the time when we had agreed to meet Ross, and he didn't show up. So that was when we became very, very concerned and went up to Paddington Police Station to report that Ross had gone missing, because in our eyes he was missing. There was something wrong. He hadn't come back when he said he was going to be back, and he was a very reliable sort of guy. So if he hadn't turned up, then something was definitely wrong.
At 4:45 on the Sunday, Craig calls Win TV in Wollongong to see if Ross has turned up for work, only to be told by panicked production staff that Ross couldn't be located. They were in the process of finding a replacement to read the news.
Obviously, being close to Ross, we couldn't just do nothing because we knew something bad had happened to him. You don't go missing and not turn up for work for a job that's so incredibly important to you, for your career and your ambition and where you want to get to in life. You know, so we knew that something bad had happened to stop him going to work. We were in a bit of a state. We couldn't just watch TV and go to bed and sleep. So we thought, well, you know, what could have happened to him? And for whatever reason, the first thing that came into my mind was, well, maybe he's gone to Marks Park. And I didn't know anywhere else where he went, so we decided to go down there and have a look. And we drove around the road that goes around the top of the park, turn around a corner, and there's Ross's car parked on the side of the street. And as soon as we saw the car there, I knew that, well, in my head, my immediate reaction was, he's come down here to do the beat and he's been bashed or killed, or, you know, something bad has happened here on that Friday night, and he's gone.
Ross's friends, including Jeff Dowse, were struggling to accept their friend's disappearance.
We were all really, really shocked, to be honest. We were scared, we were frightened. We didn't know what had happened, we were confused. So
Ross Warren's mysterious disappearance creates a sensation in the press.
When the story hit the media on the Monday, it was quite distressing because on a couple of accounts, not just because basically Ross was outed, and for him that would have been hugely humiliating and a breach of his privacy, which he valued so highly, not only from a personal point of view, but for his family, who knew he was gay and accepted it about as much as a lot of parents did back in those days, and probably still do, and that, you know, tolerated maybe a better word. Still loved him and treated him, you know, as their son, but weren't entirely happy that he was gay.
Jeff Dowse was also slightly disconcerted by the treatment of Ross's disappearance in the media.
But what I was disappointed about with what I read in the media was that it was almost like it was painted that because you were gay and because you put yourself in a situation like that, it was entirely your fault. And that made me angry. I think it would have made Ross angry, because further down the track, when you realise what potentially has happened, no one deserves that. I was angry, I was upset, I was scared for Ross because the fear he must have felt and the loneliness he must have felt during those times. No one deserves to feel like that, you know. I imagine Ross would have put up a fight. I believe he would have been outnumbered. That's what I think. Ross was a fighter. You don't get to where Ross was getting to without fighting.
Despite all the media attention, Craig and Paul are frustrated that the police don't seem to be doing very much. And so they return to the headland, walking the cliffside path several times over, until Craig sees something glistening in a honeycombed rock face.
We saw something glinting in the sunlight, and we walked a little closer to it, and we could see that it was actually a bunch of keys, and it was Ross's keys, and they were sitting under a lip of rock. I guess there was a ledge, and within that ledge there was a little lip where the keys were sitting. So we were shocked, obviously, to see the keys there and puzzled as to how they got there, because they were in a position where they couldn't have fallen in there. So they looked as if they had been placed in there, and we couldn't figure out if they had been placed there by Ross or placed there by someone who had found the keys.
Ross's family, his mum, his dad, his younger sister and brother, are understandably shell-shocked and traumatised by his mysterious disappearance.
About a week or two after Ross went missing, his parents made the decision to come down to Sydney and to go actually down to Wollongong as well, pack up Ross's stuff, because everyone, I guess, knew that Ross probably wasn't coming back. I think they flew down here, they picked up his car from the police station and drove down to Wollongong, I think, and tidied up Ross's stuff and packed his personal belongings away. And I guess they must have done something about his furniture and selling that or disposing it of some way. And I can't imagine what it would have been like for his parents going into the flat that their son was living in and having to go through all his belongings and throw them out or sell them or pack them up and put them in the car. It's one thing when someone dies and you feel the grief, and you know that grief can last a long time and forever sometimes. But when someone goes missing, you don't know exactly how to feel other than a confusion and loss and sadness and unknowing. So, I mean, that must have just been incredibly hard for them. And then having to drive his car from Wollongong up to Sydney, and they came to our place and picked up the stuff that he had left at our place. And I remember, them coming and seeing us and talking about what had happened. And I remember them getting in the car and driving off and thinking that they've got to sit in his car for another 10 hours and be surrounded by him without having him there. So his presence, but not their son, which was the most important thing. How sad and unfair that was, that he had been probably highly likely murdered by someone for being gay, because that's the way he was born, and how incredibly unfair and sad that was for him and everyone who loved him.
A year passes by, and without a proper investigation, there are still no answers to explain Ross's mysterious disappearance. Craig Ellis's now former boyfriend Paul is living in Hong Kong and receives a phone call from a detective in Sydney. There's been a murder on the cliff face virtually a year to the day after Ross disappeared, of a Thai national called Kritchakorn Ratanajarathaporn. But neither Paul nor Craig Ellis hears from the police again. Not until a winter's day in the new millennium.
The winner is Sydney, Australia.
It was Sydney's year of glory, the Olympics. In May 2000, only 4 months before the opening ceremony of the Sydney Olympics, Detective Sergeant Steve Page is sitting in his office in Paddington Police Station, rifling through some letters. Steve Page takes us back to that moment in 2000 when he opened a letter from Kay Warren, Ross's mother, which would lead him to launch an investigation that would consume years of his life.
Putting in context as far as time, so May 2000, I received a file, so no difference to any other form of correspondence that you'd get as a police officer. You might get a file to chase up an exhibit, something as inane as that. But attached to this file was a letter from Kay Warren. She was just simply asking that processes could be put in place so that her son Ross could be formally declared deceased through the coroner's court so that she could in some way close out his affairs. But what caught my eye was that attached to that letter were many others that Kay had kept copies of, where she'd sent letters off to the New South Wales Police asking for assistance and asking for support, and nothing had been done. There was letters back to Kay assuring her that we'll review this matter and keep you posted, but nothing was done. I just felt for Kay. I had a young son myself, just over that 12 months old at that point in time. And I thought, how horrible it must be as a parent to have a child missing. You just want to have some support, some backing to find out what's happened to them, and doors are being shut. I thought that was quite cold. So I took it up then and there and just made a decision that, I'd do what I could to have that matter closed out for Kay.
After 11 years of not getting a satisfactory answer to what happened to her son, Kay Warren simply wanted him declared dead so she could attend to his affairs. Page had a lengthy phone conversation with Kay Warren.
With Kay, it was an introduction and assurances from me that I'd investigate the matter, and Kay was appreciative of the assurances that she was getting, but I'm sure in her own mind, she'd had those before in writing, and she probably didn't know whether it'd get backed up.
Page then remembered he had a friend, a former Wind cameraman, James Baker, who back in 1989 had mentioned the strange disappearance of Warren when both Page and Baker were in the Army Reserves.
There was a couple of coincidences with this one. So in 1989, I'm in the police, but I'm also doing part-time service with the Australian Army, and I'm doing officer training. And one of the other guys on my course was a cameraman for Wind TV. And back then he's just having a chat, and he goes, something's really strange happening at work. One of the guys I work with has gone missing. Everyone's quite concerned. We don't know what happened to him. And I didn't take much notice of that at the time, but it certainly the penny dropped later on that he was talking about Ross Warren.
In a phone conversation, Baker tells Page that everyone believed Ross was murdered, but the police never really treated it as a murder investigation. When Page called other friends and colleagues of Ross's, they echoed the same sentiment. Ross's former makeup artist at Wynn, Christine Jones, told Page that Ross wasn't depressed, had everything to live for, and, to quote her words, was too much of a wimp to kill himself like that. Another friend, hotel owner Rowan Legg, was emphatic. "I have no doubt Ross was hoisted off a cliff," he said. When he opened the files into Ross Warren's investigation, Steve Page found a number of startling omissions.
What I started to search for was just records, business records in relation to Ross. Now, one thing that I did find was an occurrence pad entry. So we've got to remember that, this is 1989. We're not using computers, back at that stage. Everything as far as police reports would be just on paper forms, carbonised. They'd have, you have carbon paper to make your duplicates, but as far as anything significant that would happen in a police station, there'd be a log, and it's called an occurrence pad. You put down details of significant incidents, time and date, what's happened, and the police involved. So I found an occurrence pad entry for the disappearance of Ross Warren. It was lengthy, and it was apparent that the occurrence pad entry was created after there were headlines around that Ross may have met with foul play, and the occurrence pad was aimed at dismissing those assertions, and that it was likely Ross may have met with his demise as a result of an accident.
Steve may have found the occurrence pad, but it was obvious that this had never been treated as a murder investigation, despite all the media attention and friends believing Ross had met with foul play.
I wasn't in the room when they were doing that original review, but as far as setting up what I would consider a robust investigation in relation to a suspicious crime, I didn't find any running sheets, no logs, no statements. There was no brief of evidence that went to coroner's court. There was no brief of evidence that went to the missing persons unit. Other than the occurrence pad entry, I found nothing in relation to what had previously been done by the original investigators.
Page decided to head his own investigation.
When it became apparent that there was no one currently working with the New South Wales Police that was involved in the original matter that could assist, I made the decision to lead the investigation in relation to the disappearance of Ross Warren. I had a number of other detectives that were working at Paddington at the time. At that stage, the roster was quite junior, and I didn't think Kay would get appropriate service if I just simply farmed it out to someone else in the team. I made a decision to lead that one myself.
One mystery continued to nag Page, however, regarding Ross Warren's disappearance. What happened to his body? Why hadn't it washed up on Bondi or Tamarama beaches the next day? Page consulted a lecturer in the School of Geography at the University of New South Wales, whose specialty was coastal geomorphology. Dr. Robert Brander examined synoptic and tidal charts for the Bondi-Tamarama headland for the month of July 1989. And made an estimate of the drift directions on a series of maps. Brander noted an area of intense turbulence around the headland, which is why it's difficult for swimmers and rock fishermen to swim back onto the platform if they've fallen off. In his accompanying map of drift directions on the Tamarama side of the headland, Brander sketched a number of arrows. They were all pointing outwards towards the Pacific Ocean. It's highly likely Ross Warren's body would have been washed out to sea within a matter of hours. Alarmingly, Page soon came across records of other murders and strange disappearances on the headland between 1989 and 1991, including the slaying of a Thai man, Krichakorn Ratana Jarathapurn, virtually a year to the day after Ross Warren vanished, for which 3 teenagers were sent to prison. Then there was a Bondi barman, John Russell, whose body was found on the bottom of the cliffs on the Bondi side of the headland. Other bodies were found floating in the ocean at the time. There were bashings and at least 1 rape on the headland. Page realised with a thump that he had not just one murder investigation on his hands, but several.
Either side of the disappearance of Ross Warren, probably 18 months either side of July 1989, there was a lot of violence associated around Marks Park. There was one victim who survived, and that was December 1989. I'd refer to him as the one that got away. So that was my star witness. If I could relate that to the Ivan Milat case, the equivalent of Paul Onions. Now, what that did, that gave us great insight in relation to who was likely to be involved in hate crime back in that era. But he wasn't alone. There was several other cases that I found with people coming forward. And unfortunately for me, there was just no shortage of suspects. It wasn't just one group of people that were involved in the bashing of gays at Marks Park. There were many groups. You had locals, you had out-of-towners that would come in. There was one group of 3 that I came across that, what they did to a gay man at Marks Park, had all the hallmarks of a jail rape. Yeah, so you've got multiple of reasons and motives in relation to the offenders and, all sorts of people that were involved. You had children as young as 12, you had teenage girls, teenage boys, you had adult males acting in packs. There was absolutely no shortage of suspects.
Page began trying to join the dots between the various murders on the headland. He was astonished by some of the links he found.
In the next episode of Bondi Badlands...
So John Russell is a Bondi local. He's just come into an inheritance and he's leaving. He's leaving Bondi. He's going up to live at Wollongong with his father, Ted.
He was starting to live life. He was starting to have his own life. He was starting to have the facilities to be able to go and do what he wanted to do.
My first immediate reaction, and everybody I know's immediate reaction, was this isn't suicide.
Bondi Badlands is sponsored by Waverley Council and ACON, a New South Wales-based health promotion organisation specialising in community health, inclusion and HIV responses for people of diverse sexualities and genders. Special thanks to our podcast guests Steve Page, Craig Ellis, Jeff Dowse and Paul Symes. Special thanks to Michael Atkinson, formerly of ACON. Bondi Badlands is based on the book of the same name by Greg Callahan, who narrates the podcast. Original theme and podcast production by Ian Cuthbertson. Extracts from Crime Investigation Australia's Bloodsport, The Bondi Gay Murders, used with permission. If this podcast has raised issues for you, contact Lifeline on 131114 or Beyond Blue on 1300 224636.